Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending this morning's workshop on the pandemic and school refusal. We're going to start now. It's 10:02, but so the program runs for about 2 hours. We'll hopefully have small breaks here and there for questions and things like that. But of course, housekeeping, if 2 hours is a long time, if you need to stretch, please, practice good self-care, Zoom self-care, as we call it these days, and go ahead and stand up and stretch. Don't feel like you are going to miss something, because we are recording. So today's program is sponsored by the Morris County Youth Providers and Community Partners. We are going to start today with going over who we are and the program objectives. We will be, darn, hold on 1 minute. My apologies. I actually can't find it right now. There
We
it
can
is.
skip the video if we need to, Allison. It's okay.
My apologies. The recording, the video that we're going to be sharing later keeps going off. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to exit out, and later you're just going to have to wait a minute while I load the video, because I don't want that to keep happening. My apologies. Let us resume. So as I said, we're going to just go over who we are, what we're doing here today, what the goals are of the program, and then we will, and I have some introductions to make. We have some great presenters, for you today. And then we'll go into our presentations. So our first presentation is going to be on the mental health effects of COVID on our youth, and the second on truancy and school refusal. Then after each presentation, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. So please use the chat to enter your questions, and I will be moderating the Q&A section at the end of each presentation. And we should be able to close up around 12 o'clock. So the Youth Advocate Committee is a subcommittee of the Morris County Continuum of Care. The Morris County Continuum of Care is both a strategic planning body and a vehicle to carry out the responsibilities of the COC as defined in the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Overall, the purpose of the COC is to plan and manage these the Morris County homeless system and housing system. The Youth Advocate Committee was created a couple of years ago. It's been almost 2 years now, to ensure that the needs of youth are considered in COC policies and planning, and that the rights of homeless youth are met. Every agency should have a youth advocate to make sure that the youth connect with their agency. The youth connected with their agency have someone they can work with directly. So if you're interested in what we're doing for youth, I know the next several months are going to be devoted to becoming more involved in the school systems. So if you're interested in those goals and you'd like to join the Youth Advocate Committee, please connect with Jennifer Amaya, who is here today, at jamaya@visionsandpathways.org. So we want to welcome our presenters today. We actually have 3 presenters, Tracy, Klingener, and Annette Hoffman from Mental Health Association, and Alanna, Angulo from, sorry, I just blanked on where you're from. Help me.
No worries. Dover Public Schools.
The Dover, okay, I see here, Dover Public School District. My apologies. So I'm going to introduce them all now. So Tracy Klingener is the Director of Suicide Prevention Services at the Mental Health Association of Essex and Morris. Tracy has been working in the mental health field for the last 20 years and is a licensed associate counselor. She is a certified mental health first aid instructor in the adult, veteran, law enforcement, older adult, and youth modules. She's a trained instructor in an evidence-based program that is utilized in schools to educate students on mental illness and suicide prevention. Tracy is also a trained instructor for the Talk Saves Lives program through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Her clinical experience includes working with sexual assault survivors, at-risk youth, and evaluating adolescents for learning disabilities. Annette Hoffman completed her undergraduate studies at the University Center at Binghamton and earned her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Bowling Green State University. In her training in clinical work following her degree, she has worked with elderly populations in a medical setting, veterans receiving services at a VA hospital, and families coping with serious mental illnesses. Annette currently works with the Suicide Prevention Program at MHA Essex and Morris and helps to provide education to the community about suicide and other mental health topics. Annette also works with the Intensive Family Support Services Program, IFSS, to provide supportive counseling to families who have an adult loved one who is coping with a serious mental illness. Annette serves on the board of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Sussex County, New Jersey, and provides services to local families in that capacity as well. Alanna is a licensed social worker and certified school social worker for the Dover Public School District. Alanna currently serves as the district's family engagement specialist, connecting families to available resources in the community. She also served as an academic advisor to students in need of academic or emotional support throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Alanna quickly recognized school refusal as a challenge in her community and worked alongside parents and school staff to better understand avoidance behavior in students. So welcome to our presenters. We're really excited to have you all. I so appreciate you. We're going to start with Tracy and Annette's presentation on the mental health effects of COVID on our youth.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I hope I'm not being spotlighted right now. So thank you for attending this morning. If you have any questions, like Allison said, put it in the chat. If there's anything that you're seeing, please put it in the chat. So the ongoing stress, fear, and grief and uncertainty really created by the pandemic has weighed heavily on our children and teens. Many have had a hard time coping emotionally. I wouldn't say everyone, because again, everyone comes from a unique situation. And as youth, they really handle things very differently, depending on their resiliency and other factors as well. So more than, I would say, over 100,000 children in the US have experienced death of a parent, a grandmother, grandparent, and really a caregiver from COVID. Many families have lost their jobs, financial instability during the pandemic, and really at the same time, vital supports such as school, healthcare services, and other community programs have really been interrupted. And many have experienced or witnessed a rise in racism during the pandemic, especially in the beginning, with families of Asian descent. And really, even with the protection of a COVID vaccine now available to children who are old enough for them, pandemic-related stress and trauma may have lasting effects on the development of children. And though our understanding of the pandemic's mental health impacts are really still evolving and changing, it's clear thus far that despite the challenges of the pandemic, children, young adults are remarkably resilient. And we're going to be talking about how you could improve the resiliency of our youth at the end of this presentation. And they're really able to cope with ongoing stresses and uncertainty in healthy ways. At the same time, certain identifiable groups of young people are more at risk for negative mental health outcomes, which we'll be talking about later. But I think a lot of it, you know, Annette and I go into schools a lot, and especially depending on the situation at school and what their policy was during COVID, whether it was virtual, all virtual, if you could go in to schools, really affected some of the stress of the youth, even the ones that don't have an identified mental illness. So for example, Annette and I were at a school not too long ago, and their policy was for kids that went to school, they had a longer break between classes. So instead of having 5 minutes, they had 10 to 15 minutes to get between their classes. And that gave them an opportunity to not only talk to their teachers, but to talk to their friends, talk to their peers. And now with it going back to 5 minutes between each classes, it's an adjustment. I know I was working at another school, and if a child decided or a parent decided that they were going to have their child remote learn, that was something that they had to stick to for the entire school year. So again, there's a lot of variables here. If you, Allison, if you could go to the slide before this, I kind of want to start at the beginning. So of course, the effects of COVID aren't just confined to children. We've all experienced isolation and loss. I know myself personally, I experienced the loss of a loved one, but it's really worthwhile to review how the pandemic has really affected children in particular. When things first shut down, it was frightening for many of us. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know what was coming next. We really didn't know what we were dealing with. You know, the roads were deserted. I know it took me, I live in Sussex County. It took me like 30 minutes to get to work instead of an hour. People were panic buying. I know my dad, he's older, so he hoards toilet paper and all that forever. So I was lucky I didn't have to worry about that, but people were panic buying. And it's really hard to put yourself back in that place, but I think we could all recall how frightening it really was. Older children may have experienced this directly, and younger children might have picked up on it from the adults in their life. Losses. Some children, again, were not able to see grandparents they were close to. They might not have been able to see friends. Play dates weren't happening. Just really the routines of everyday life were completely disrupted. For a time, many children couldn't participate in activities that really provided them some outlet for stress, you know, art class, sports, theater, and really depending on the age group, they were missing graduation, school concerts, school dances, you know, no prom, school trips, apple picking even. I know I had to throw that in there because of this time of year. So if you go to the next slide, Allison, so traumatic loss. I wanted to talk about some special circumstances. Again, you know, we all come from different circumstances and all experience different circumstances from the pandemic. And here are some I just wanted to focus on. So from April of 2020 through the end of June of 21, data suggests that more than 140,000 children under the age of 18 lost a parent, a caregiver. So if we look at it a different way, because I know sometimes that's a hard number to grasp, this translates to about 1 in 500 children. So these children experienced and continue to cope with a sudden and traumatic loss of one of their primary care givers. And trauma is really the number one risk factor when we talk about developing a mental illness. That's why protective factors, resiliency is so important. And a loss is a risk factor for suicide as well. So we have to consider all this, you know, all this happening to children. So severe financial losses. So if a caregiver lost income needed really for basic needs, then this becomes the focus of parents. For these families, satisfying basic needs really became the focus. And there was an elevated anxiety for everyone that really experienced this firsthand. You know, children with special needs, some children rely heavily on that in-class support to really learn. And it's really impossible really to fully replicate that with virtual learning. And this really left parents to fill in when they could. Also, again, as I said before, children face discrimination. You know, there was increased anti-Asian discrimination. And some children worried about their safety. So if you go to the next slide, long-term effects are really unknown at this point because this experience is so new. I was reading about a study done in Texas that found rates of suicide behavior reported from January of 2020 were up by 25% compared to the rates observed the previous year in 2019. So in particular months with the highest suicide rates, they really corresponded with how prevalent COVID was in the surrounding communities. So in other words, when COVID concern was heightened, there was a higher rate of suicidal thinking. And I remember talking to a nurse in the psychiatric unit at a local hospital here, and she was saying that there was an increase of youth coming in to get screened because they were saying they were having thoughts of suicide because of the virtual learning piece, and how you know, people and youth were really being bullied in a new way because other students were able to see into their home, so what their home looked like, you know, even their parents. So it was a new type of bullying that we were seeing. And I was also looking at research through the CDC, and though most of 2020, the proportion of emergency admissions for mental health problems like panic and anxiety were up by 24% for younger children and 31% for adolescents, really compared to previous years. And if you go to the next slide, so even if there was no serious disruptions created by any of the things I mentioned, kids who are really struggling with a mental health issue were more likely to struggle, well, really more with the effects of COVID and the effects of the social isolation than those who didn't have any mental health issues. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Annette, who's going to talk about really anxiety and what to look for in our younger youth and our teen population. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, so anxiety in children, and we're going to talk about anxiety in children in general, but also in younger children and older children and teenagers, because it could look very different. So it's important to remember that children cannot process the world in sophisticated ways because of their stage of their development. So they don't necessarily realize when their fear reactions are irrational or pervasive. They only know what they're feeling, right? So and they find it difficult to communicate about anxiety. So what you might see are other kinds of symptoms. So you might see frequent nightmares and disturbed sleep, constant restlessness. Because of the disturbed sleep, they might be tired in school, have difficulty concentrating. They might fall asleep in school. They might be very irritable because they're just not, they don't have all their resources to work from. They may cry, have tantrums. I think emotional regulation for some kids has been real difficult because of the pandemic. Okay, and then the next slide. Okay, So developmentally, being away from school and having all that kind of socialization, to some extent, young kids need to feel safe, and they could get that at home with their parents, if the parents were able to be home with them, right? So, but for some kids, this resulted in only socializing with the adults who are their parents. And so they didn't really learn how to socialize with teachers or other kids their age. And that really kind of set them behind in terms of learning those social rules. You don't act the same with with a teacher or with other school staff as you do with your parents. And I have a neighbor who's a 5th grade teacher, so it's a little older, but she was telling me that kids are really behind with that stuff. They'll interact with teachers in ways that they hadn't before, and she thinks they kind of missed out on just real life interaction. And some of that is because she's thinking they were on screen so much, and they didn't really have that practice interacting with people in real life, right? It was sort of a passive thing. So she finds that herself and her teachers at her school have to do a lot more of support and educate, and coaching kids how to behave appropriately, whereas that's something they would have learned earlier had they not missed school. And then if it's not too much trouble to play the video, because the young kids, they get so much practice in speech and developing those things and those skills, they really had some developmental delays. And we have a brief clip that illustrates that, if we can play it. It'll just take a minute, I think.
Allison, if you can play it, okay.
We've talked a lot the past few weeks about the pandemic's impact as school-age kids return to the classroom. But what about our younger children? Experts tell 11 Alive little ones are feeling the effect of the past year and a half as well. Liza Lucas talks to experts who are seeing an increase in kids needing some extra support as they learn to talk and communicate. It's all new this morning.
Ready, set, go.
Don't be fooled by the race cars or Mr. Potato Head.
Push. Push.
These aren't just toys.
Oh, he's here. I hear you.
They're important tools for learning.
The most important thing for children is to play with them. Play is how a child learns.
Experts like speech therapist Jesse Willis are concerned important playtime and socialization as kids lost during the pandemic, as families isolated and screen time increased. The early intervention team at Easter Seals, North Georgia, is now seeing an increase in developmental delays in young children.
A lot of families are telling us that their child doesn't have any friends and doesn't get to play with other children. And because of that, we're seeing a huge increase. It's the lack of socialization.
A lot of it's speech, a lot of behavior. Sometimes when we get started with families, they're like, I knew something was up. I knew something was going on.
While it's tempting for parents to take a wait-and-see approach, experts encourage intervention at the first sign of a delay. And parents like Lauren say programs like Babies Can't Wait can help.
They are providing early intervention and therapy to kids at such a crucial time in development when their brains are still very malleable and receptive.
To help your child at home, experts say just talking through even the smallest task
Where's it going to go?
can make a difference.
On. Sitting on the floor, talking to your child, playing with them, and also going through like daily activities like washing the dishes or taking a bath. Those are excellent times to foster language and to teach your child new vocabulary.
Now, experts tell me they're getting referrals from all ages, but mostly from children born before or during the pandemic. So think our 2-year-olds. But there are resources available, and that's the message this morning. You can get a free health screening for Babies Can't Wait, and we have more information on childhood developmental milestones for you on 11alive.com. Aisha.
All right, very insightful, Liza. Thank you. Experts say an increase in referrals not necessarily a bad thing, but is a sign that families are getting help. It is easy to assume that those little ones are just not fazed by the pandemic and all the changes. But experts do emphasize the first few years, Liza, of a child's life are so critical for development. We got to keep them sharp. Thanks,
That's right.
Liza.
Okay. Okay, so you can see that video really highlights the kind of developmental delays that kids who missed out on a year and a half of socialization, had some effects. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so again, for infants, toddlers, and young children, they may show some backwards in the progress in the skills they were developing, and they may show other things, fussiness, irritability, crying more readily, trouble falling asleep, feeding issues, nausea, vomiting, constipation, loose stool, so physical symptoms, being more anxious when they have to separate from their family, because instead of starting preschool when they normally would, they might have had to wait, and so they might have separation anxiety a little later than they might have without the pandemic interrupting everything. And then dealing with their own emotions, they may have a lower frustration level, which may lead to tantrums or fighting with other kids. They might have been potty trained, but now are having trouble because they're having trouble adjusting. And then we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to turn a bit to older, so to the teenage, middle school, teenage years. And so there was a study. So teenagers feel like mental health is really more significant for them now. They're having more conversations about it. 67% agreed with the statement, "I am hopeful that I will adapt and rebound from the challenges of the pandemic." And of course, this is true for some kids, but for kids, as Tracy was saying earlier, who've really been hit hard in terms of losing a loved one or having a severe financial crisis, their situation is completely different, and it's more of a traumatic event for those children. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so it's important to think about the developmental needs of kids of different ages. So when kids enter middle school years, they have to learn a lot about where do they fit in, right? Who their social groups are, where do they feel comfortable? And that takes practice. And if they were home a lot, or, like in our district, they were, went to school. If they opted to do school, they were in 1 week and then home the other week or 2 weeks, I can't even remember. But it was not a steady, social situation. Half the class was there. It was difficult for them to sort of work out these sort of social, where they fit in, where their niche is, when, everything's so unpredictable. For older children, like teenagers, one of their major developmental tasks is to separate from their parents, to be more independent. And that, if you're stuck for a year and a half with your immediate family, those kinds of, that kind of practice is hard to come by. And I have a college student, she's 22 now, and she was home remotely. And then I have a junior, she's gone back as a junior to high school. So I have a lot of personal experience with those kinds of challenges and the difficulty of them re-entering to normal life. So these are just some important things to keep in mind. If we go to the next slide. Okay, so what kinds of signs of distress might you see in older children and adolescents? So if they have a change in mood, loss of interest in things that they used to like, sleep disturbance, appetite disturbance, they might have difficulty focusing, changes in appearance, they might engage in risky behavior. And if they're really struggling with, depression, anxiety, getting back into the swing of things, thoughts of suicide. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a great poem, and actually, I think my daughter could have written this poem. My daughter she liked school. She always felt like her school day went by really quickly, and now she just doesn't have the same enthusiasm for it. I mean, she's doing fine, but I think the day drags for her. It's just more difficult somehow. So anyway, so this is a poem by Ashley Coe, who is a high school senior, about returning to class this fall. And she lives in California. So this is from the New York Times, and they put out this poem and asked kids, teenagers returning to school, what's your experience been like, and what do you identify with Ashley's poem? And I'll just read it quickly. Walked into school 9 to 12, swarming like bees. Luckily, I did not get a heart attack. I was pretty close to the parking lot, had many thoughts of turning back until, Ashley, I haven't seen you so long. Do I hug? Do I awkwardly stand 6 feet away? Sitting in AP language and composition, forgetting that I walk into a classroom, not a Zoom link. 30 minutes into class, I miss my cat. 40 minutes into class, I miss going to the bathroom without an e-pass. 50 minutes into class, I miss my snack pantry quite desperately. 60 minutes into class, I need to switch my pants into sweatpants right now. 70 minutes into class, I cannot wait to go home. But I still have 2 more classes to go. And I think, just looking at all the responses to this poem, I think a lot of kids were feeling that, oh, it's just hard to get back into that routine again. And, but most of the responses that we're seeing, it's like, okay, I've got my footing now. It takes a while. I'm getting used to, that routine. But it takes a while to get there. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so concerns about school, about learning, about falling behind. I think a lot of kids, I know a lot of parents, from my own experience, felt like everybody was thrown into this all of a sudden, right? So, it took a while for schools to get up and running with remote learning and how to do it well and how to accommodate and how to accommodate kids. They didn't want them on staring at a screen all day. So I think a lot of us had shortened days or altered schedules and all this kind of stuff. It was a bad situation for everyone. But I think, now that they're all going back, I know for my daughter, it's like she feels like some teachers expect them to get back to teaching their level of class, assuming that they learned everything last year the way they usually would have. And she finds like, we didn't learn that, so there's concerns about school. And I think it depends, where the kid is, my daughter goes back as a junior, and there's all this emphasis of preparing for college and all this kind of stuff. And it can, she does experience a lot of pressure regarding that. And sometimes I sit back and I think she's never had a full year of school, and she's a junior, right? So she was freshman till March, and then most of last year remote. Now she's going back, and she has to think about leaving. So it's if you think about it that way, it's just a really difficult transition to make. But then again, she wasn't a senior. I was so happy that she wasn't a senior. She didn't miss all those wonderful things, graduation and senior prom and all that stuff. But anyway, so I think a lot of kids have anxiety about returning and about feeling up to all the challenges. They lost their mojo, so to speak, right? And I think that is a concern for a lot of kids, and a lot of kids might experience heightened anxiety because of that. So, and for those families, as we said, who have economic hardship or traumatic loss, it's a whole different ballgame. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, so we just wanted to touch on social media, just because during the pandemic, I think teens were on social media a lot. And for some teens, it gave them an outlet. They could play games remotely with their friends. So that was kind of nice. But some of the social media was passive watching things passively. And that has been associated, when they look back at the effects of the pandemic, on kids not doing as well, having more anxiety, more depression, and not, having that active interaction with socialization. So it really depends what you're looking at. It does not necessarily all bad or all good. Social media, you can find things that you're interested in and common interests with with a hobby or something like that. So, but it did, I think, fill up a lot of time for teens when they were isolated at home. So I think it's an important thing for us to look at. And some of the stuff on social media, we all know, is terrible. And so that, would affect kids in a negative way when they have to get back out there in the real world and, act in appropriate ways when they've had influences on social media that were not particularly role models, as we'll say. So we could go to the next slide. Okay, here's just some tips on supporting teens. Just things to look out for, and ways you can support them. So look out for big changes in behavior, mood, and habits. Keep the lines of communication open. I think we make a mistake in just saying, "Oh, we're back to normal." I mean, with the exception of wearing masks all the time. And let's just forget that happened. I think there are after effects from what happened, and you need to be open to what kids have to say about it. Validate their emotions. Prioritize that emotional support. Make space for grief, for significant grief, or even grief about as Tracy was saying earlier, things that they missed. They didn't get to be in a musical. They didn't. There are things that they missed having that involve some sadness. Teens might have come up with new routines, new hobbies, new things, and that's all good. And the importance of sleep is just huge. They did do a study, and they found that when they followed kids before, during the pandemic, and after, and they found that providing structure in their day during the pandemic, and being mindful of self-care, and also staying away from scary news media about the pandemic, because those things can be very frightening. Rather, you want to have age-appropriate discussions about what's going on. But some of the news media, I mean, if you watch it, it's frightening to all of us, right? So, and also if you model good self-care, that's helpful. And those kids who did those things of limited passive screen time, got good sleep, they fared better when the pandemic was over. Okay, and of course, reach out for help if you need to. In the next slide. Okay, this is just some tips about how to know if extra support is needed. Look for signs of distress, and they can differ from person to person, of course. In young children, as we discussed before, irritability, crying easily, difficulty sleeping, tantrums, difficulty separating from a parent, hitting or biting. It doesn't necessarily mean you need major support in those situations, but just be mindful and keep track, and can they get back on track with things going back to normal. Older children and adolescents, loss of interest in things they once enjoyed. That's a big one. Lack of sleep, changes in mood that are not typical for your child. And, of course, that's outside of normal mood changes that, teens will have. Problems with memory, an increase in reckless behavior is another important thing to keep track of. And then next slide. This is just some tips to help a child or teen through trauma. And of course, this could be a presentation in itself, but acknowledge and identify emotions, encourage proper regulation of emotions, emphasize positive attention, decrease stimulation. If it's just too much to do all that stuff that you used to do, then you can break down things into smaller things, or choose where you want, where the child would like to focus their energy. They don't have to do a million after school things. They could limit, right? Meet them where they are. empathize with the feelings that they have, that they feel about, being back in school, or, they've missed certain things. And like I said before, I think it's a mistake to minimize that. It doesn't mean they can't go back to normal, but it might take a little longer than we would all hope, of course, right? And then also, teenagers need space to, regulate. And I know my older daughter, it does wonders for her. She's got ADHD, and so she's got some emotional dysregulation, I would say, and just to sort of check out for a while is hugely helpful to her. And just to separate, listen to music, or whatever it works to sort of regain your balance, right? And if your emotions are elevated, you need to just sort of, or agitation, you need to just sort of bring that down. And that's different for different kids. Okay, and I think Tracy's going to pick it up from here.
I think you're on mute, Tracy.
God, I was just talking to myself. So in the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about the importance of resiliency and how it's such an important protective factor in our youth. Annette and I actually go into elementary schools and talk to students about resiliency, about coping strategies, about their own mental health. So here are just some points on resiliency. So decades of research on child development shows that the most important ingredient for children's well-being and resiliency is feeling loved. Feeling loved brings really a sense of stability, a sense of security that enables children to cope with adversity. So whether that be at school or home or whatever the situation is. And you could be an adult that children turn to for help, for caring, for support. And I think that's so important. So you could really be a trusted adult for these youth. And having one trusted adult in your life is one of the most important protective factors in our youth. Help them make space for emotions. When, a lot of times when Annette and I run groups, we put up what's known, or what I call, as the emotions wheel. And we have people go around and let us know what emotion they've been experiencing for the last week or so. So children and adults may feel all sorts of emotions, which might change from day to day too, as we all know. And there's simply no wrong way to feel. And I think that's important that we let our youth know that, because a lot of times parents, adults think that youth are being dramatic when they're not. So depending on whether they're in their emotional development, kids may or may not know what they're feeling and how to feel better. And these feelings can be very overwhelming and get in the way of being able to regulate their actions so they could have an enjoyable time with others. So it's helpful to create a safe space for catching their emotions. For example, instead of saying you have nothing to worry about or it'll be okay, let them get it out and help them make sense of their feelings. Sometimes, we all need a good cry. I know I felt like that yesterday. And Annette knows what I'm talking about. So a few things that you could try is notice any big feelings they may be having. So observe and reflect to them emotions showing up in their facial expressions, their tone of voice, their posture, their behavior. Ask open-ended questions and really keep an open mind. Like I was saying, we want to listen to them non-judgmentally. Open questions create a space for them to reflect and speak thoughts aloud. And this could really help them with processing their emotions and help you with really understanding how they're feeling. And we want to practice active listening, which helps them feel heard. And everyone really wants to be heard when they're talking about how they're feeling, and nourish the connections they have with you and with other adults. Often offer labels, or ways to describe how they're feeling. So like I was saying about that emotions wheel. And this could be especially helpful for younger kids who may have a more limited emotional vocabulary. Some studies show that when we hear or say a word that feels like it fits for how we feel inside, the emotional center of our brains automatically calm down. Being able to recognize and name feelings is important for building their ability on how to manage their emotions. So validate their emotional experiences. We can't help what we feel. Even if we know it's not logical or helpful sometimes, again, Annette knows what I'm talking about with yesterday. So with many experiences being so new and big, children often have big feelings in a situation that do not really seem to affect others. So having an adult validate their feelings can be so helpful and really make them feel understood, and will allow them to come to us in the future. Some feelings can be very big and scary, and supporting them in feelings and understanding their emotions can help them really ride it out. So they can experience how things will eventually get better, and being able to sit with uncomfortable emotions without shutting down or running away from them is really a huge part in resiliency. Promote a sense of mastery. So kids who are resilient believe in their competence and their ability to cope with every situations, even ones that are new to them or more challenging than any really that they have encountered before. And this sense of mastery is something we could really help them with and help them to foster. So if you go to the next slide, I just kind of wanted to put this in there because we really need to learn to take one day at a time. I know I have trouble with this on a daily basis. I'm a big what ifer. I'm always planning for the future, and that's not a bad way, but sometimes when we're dealing with some stressful situations, it can add more stress if we're thinking about what's to come. Well, what if this happens? So I think it's so important to take it day by day, step by step, and to let our kids know that. So the next slide, the Mental Health Association actually created a suicide prevention website, which I'll put in the chat. And this website goes over warning signs of suicide, how to speak to a child that you're concerned about, what to say, what not to say. It also provides testimonials of individuals who have attempted suicide, have lost a family or friend to suicide. It gives a whole bunch of youth resources. So it's really this website's for youth, it's for trusted adults. Anyone could really benefit on checking this website out, because I always say it takes a village when it comes to suicide prevention and education and reducing that stigma. So if you go to the next slide, here are some youth resources. So the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, great resource. When you call that, in the beginning, for a few seconds, you hear silence. And then you get notified that you contacted the Lifeline. You get notified that it's actually the Veterans Crisis Line as well. And then you hear music and it's connecting you to your nearest crisis center that the Lifeline's partnered with. In July of 2022, they're actually rolling out a 3-digit number. So it's going to be 988. So instead of calling that 1-800 number, you could just dial 988. Now, again, that's when they're rolling it out. Cell phone carriers are actually trying to get ahead of that. And I know I got notified, I think it was last week, that Verizon has it activated. So I was like, no way. So I actually called, and the 988 number works. I know for sure with Verizon, I believe AT&T as well, but I'm not 100% sure. But I know Verizon is up and running with the 988 number. Second Floor is a great resource for youth as well. So if a youth is in crisis, they could call or text that number. The Trevor Lifeline is for youth in the LGBTQ community. So that 1-866 number is for when a youth is in crisis. The text number is if a youth just wants support. And then there's the crisis text line, that's for adults and youth. If someone's in crisis, they could text that number. If someone's just having a bad day, they could also utilize that number. And Allison, if you go to the next slide, these are youth lines run by youth for youth. And when I say youth, I'm really talking about, you know, the 12-year-olds to 24-year-olds. And again, these lines are for youth, run by youth. So they're a great option as well. And then the next slide has my contact information. So if you're looking for any educational presentations, if you have any questions for Annette and I, and you don't want to put it in the chat, you could always email us. And then on the next slide is Annette's information. And that's it. That's all we have. If there's any questions, please put it in the chat. I know Bonnie had a question. So of course, Bonnie, you could definitely reuse the poem if you'd like for your clients.
Thank you, Tracy and Annette. I appreciate so much this presentation, really fascinating. And actually, I have to say, you know, I have 2 young children, and they were in pre-K and daycare when we started the pandemic, and it was a challenge. You know, what do you do with them? And these are early. There's one of them right now because the daycare closed because of the weather. So my husband just ran out of the room with him. You know, like it can be, you know, childcare itself is really hard, but I mean, certainly when they were home for a really, really long time and they only had, I was very thankful actually that we had 2, because if we had just had the one, that person would have been only completely alone, or, you know, with just an adult, and we're boring and not that much fun. And so, you know, it was definitely a challenge. And, you know, we did see in small ways, you know, that it was a challenge for them. So that was really, really interesting for me. I loved it. I would like to just sort of, you know, so Bonnie had asked that question about, can you reuse this? I'm wondering too, just what services that MHA does for, you know, because you mentioned that you're going out to schools and things like that. If you could talk a little bit more about, you know, we have a lot of providers in the room. To what level can you provide, number one, provider education on these topics, and number 2, education in the community?
So Annette and I will literally speak to anyone, like get us in front of anyone. We love educating the community. We've done presentations involving self-help, self-care, coping strategies, resiliency, mindfulness. We talk to parents about how they could spot the signs and symptoms of mental illness in their child or warning signs of suicide, how to start that conversation. So what to say, what not to say. We go into schools and provide education to teachers, faculty, staff on mental health, mental illness, and suicide prevention. We actually have been bringing in an evidence-based program that is done for the students that teaches the students how to acknowledge the signs of depression and warning signs in a friend, how to start a conversation with them, and also who to tell as far as a trusted adult. After that, there is a questionnaire for students that focus on depression and suicide. After the presentation, they're collected and looked at to see if a student might be struggling. And Annette and I were at middle school quite a while ago, but 3 students were actually identified as being in crisis that were kind of under the school's radar. So a lot of times schools will know if a student's struggling, but these were students that were completely under the school's radar that without this program might have potentially died by suicide. So I love this program. We actually work with elementary schools, like I was saying earlier, to bring in another evidence-based program where it really starts that resiliency process early with 5 to 11-year-olds and teaching them about mental health, teaching them kind of what to look for if they're struggling, and then how to cope and who their trusted adults are. Because I feel like the earlier we could start to educate kids, the more we could help them and maybe prevent them from having mental health issues in the future. And I'm going to put this in the chat as well. The Mental Health Association actually got funding to start a COVID crisis counseling program. A lot of C's there, where we provide counseling to individuals who have been affected by COVID. So kids, adults, they have art therapy programs for kids and adults as well. And it's all free of charge. And all the things that I mentioned, all the educational stuff is also free of charge. So I will actually put in Janaea is the young lady who oversees the COVID program. So I'll put her information in the chat. If anyone wants to contact her for free counseling services, they offer support groups as well. And again, art therapy.
Thank you. And Tracy, there was another question in the chat. Annette is asking, is there a cost to have you come out to the schools?
Nope, everything's free.
I had another question. You talked a little bit about some of the other social factors, social environmental factors that, so I'm wondering about, a lot of our focus is on housing instability with the COC and with CAS. And so have you seen sort of, maybe you can speak anecdotally to what the effect has been on children, and youth, and again, and Annette, you mentioned that you have children in the college system too. So when we define youth, we actually define youth up to 24, age 24 for our services. And so, and I think most service providers usually put that, so for youth overall, are you seeing sort of an increase in these sort of other psychosocial factors like increased financial insecurity in the household, possible housing instability in the household, and how that's affecting youth and their mental health?
So absolutely. Housing, like you all know, housing, financial stability, They're all basic needs that need to be met to really foster mental health growth in our youth. And when that's shaken, it could cause an increase in anxiety. It could cause an increase in depression. Again, trauma is really one of the greatest risk factors for developing a mental illness, and anything could be traumatic. And when we're talking about housing, financial instability, that's one of the main ones. And Annette, I don't know if you want to speak to any of that as well.
Well, I just, some of the things we were talking about in terms of helping children through this and you going back to normal, if you're worried about paying the rent, paying your mortgage, as a parent, you can only, focus on, so much. So I think that sort of blocks out the sun. And so it's just logistically more difficult to provide support for your kids because you're so weighed down by these other things, which are so important for your whole family. So I just, wanted to
and
throw that in.
as kids, they take a lot of cues from adults, like we were saying, and they could feel their anxiety, their parents' anxiety, their caregivers' anxiety. So they're going to feed off of that. That's why I think utilizing the supports that these agencies offer, the supports that are in their school system, could really go a long way.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat box. I do have one other question, like a follow-up question from before. But if anybody has a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat box or raise your hand or something, just so I know that you do have another question. Otherwise, I'll just monopolize the time. So the other question I actually was thinking about when you were talking about, Tracy, that an example of a few weeks ago going into a school and doing these assessments and finding that 3 children were actually, exhibiting potential signs of suicide risk behavior. And so what I want to know is what happened with those kids? Like what were the interventions that were done after you made those, after you identified that?
So the school obviously followed their protocol. They actually were sent out to the hospital to get screened to see if they needed to be hospitalized or not. They were deemed to not be a harm to themselves and were given referrals to therapy out in the community, but they were still struggling with those suicidal thoughts. And, without intervention, like I said earlier, who knows what would have happened to them in the future. That's why I think education is so important, because if we recognize these warning signs, we could potentially save a life. And I think what I love about going to the schools and educating students is I think they're the most underutilized resource when it comes to suicide prevention. And, youth are more likely to talk to their friends than an adult if they are struggling. So that's why if we or give youth these tools to help a friend or a classmate, again, we could potentially save a life. And it's not the youth's job to make that friend not suicidal. It's just to recognize that there might be an issue and to tell a trusted adult.
So, for instance, when they're identified and, they're released, but they're referred for community support, what therapy or counseling resources are available to youth in the county, particularly for kids who might be underinsured or whose families don't have the financial ability maybe to pay like lots of copays for things like that?
Well, they could definitely utilize our program, the COVID counseling program. We actually have a behavioral health program on the Essex side as well. Annette, do you know of any services in particular that you'd like to bring up?
Well, it's funny, I was giving a talk.
Oh yeah, perform
yesterday.
care.
Yeah,
But
I
go
was
ahead.
giving a talk yesterday, and this is true for children, especially it's true for my work with IFSS. It's just so hard to access services right now. There's waiting lists a mile long. Even when you're in the crisis center, you're sitting in the emergency room for 3 days. That's true for a lot of our IFSS families. It's just the demand is so great that it's just hard for everyone. And there was a mom who was sharing, she just had trouble getting someone immediately. So so she used Perform Care, which services kids, and she was able to get someone more quickly, and she actually had a very good experience using Perform Care. So I would say Perform Care is a good resource.
Thank you. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. I don't see any hands up. I think this is your last chance if you wanted to ask a question. So thank you again to Tracy and Annette. This was a great presentation, really, really thorough. Again, can't thank you enough. I can see Tracy is putting her contact information in the chat box. What I think we can do is, because we are a few minutes ahead of our scheduled programming, and we have been sitting here for a little over an hour, I'd like to do a 5-minute break, give everybody a chance to like I said, stretch, use the restroom, grab a quick snack, whatever you need to do to get your mind back in order, so that when we come back, Alanna's gonna do a great presentation on the school refusal part of the program. So go ahead, take a 5-minute break. I'm gonna pause the recording for now, and take yourself off camera, do what you need to do, and we'll see you in five minutes. So, maybe about, well, it's 11:08. So let's say 7 minutes, 11:15. Let's do a hard start at 11:15. Okay. Okay, so we're back with Alanna Angulo. I'm going to go back to the presentation from earlier. Where is it? Here we are. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alanna Angulo, and in my work with families and students in the Dover Public School District, especially during the pandemic, I was able to see firsthand what school refusal really looked like and what it was. So I'm excited to share with you all this morning my perspective on it. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's begin with what school refusal is. When we are talking about school refusal, we are describing the set of behaviors that a child experiences when they are having difficulty attending school or staying in school. And these behaviors are related to anxiety or emotional distress. These behaviors may be prompted by transitional periods or stressful life events. Transitional periods now, they may refer to a student's transition from elementary school to middle school or from middle school to high school. But what we are seeing a lot of now is that struggle from the transition from remote learning back in the spring to now in-person full-time instruction. I think it's important to note that there is this normal sense of anxiety when children enter school for the first time. So we're talking about our preschoolers, our kindergartners. But when we're talking about school refusal, we're talking about a more chronic emotional distress and anxiety related to their school refusal. Oh, sorry, can we go back? Thank you. And these stressful life events, we're talking about events that require sometimes the children to be out of school for a period of time, such as the pandemic or having to quarantine due to illness. Being home for that period of time, it causes the students to develop somewhat of a habit of becoming comfortable at home, wanting to stay home. And once this habit is formed, the students can create a sense of fear in what it means to actually go back. So now that we've been home for a while, a student may think, well, how will I make friends again when and if I go back to school? How will I succeed after not doing my work for 2 to 3 weeks? Or even for some of our kids, the whole school year last year was a real challenge in getting work done. Next slide, please. So school refusal can look very different from one child versus another, but in general, it does have a gradual onset. So it may start off with some complaining, whining, that generally leads into more persistent negative statements about school. I hate school, I can't go back there. What will I do when I am there? And then we may also hear a child express some anxiety or express some apprehension about going to school or about something that can happen at school. What happens if I get called on in class? School refusal can also look like frequent absences, frequent lateness, total school avoidance, and we also hear a lot of somatic complaints. So typically when it's time to get to school in the morning, a child may say, oh, I have a headache or I have a stomach ache, or they're experiencing dizziness. And this can result in struggle on part of the parents in the morning getting their child to school. So this feeds into the lateness. And this can also happen during the school day. Children may typically ask, can I go to the nurse's office? Can I go to guidance because I'm not feeling well? And this feeds into the cycle of, okay, now I have to be sent home. And now I'm enjoying being at home because I don't have to be here at school with forced socialization or bullies, or again, that fear of maybe being picked on in class. I also added this last bullet, avoidance of distance learning. I think it's something we're not seeing too much now that we are in person full time, but definitely in the spring, when we first transitioned to distance learning, we saw that children weren't willing to, or I shouldn't say willing to, weren't able to have the energy to turn their cameras on. They weren't signing in for attendance virtually. They weren't participating online. And again, this is because of that emotional distress or anxiety that they're experiencing related to attending school and doing virtual learning for the first time, probably ever. Next, please. All right. I believe it's common that children who are experiencing school refusal are grouped with or described similarly to children who are truant. And if there is anything that you all can take away from my time with you today, I really hope it's the understanding of the distinction between the two groups. In school refusal, again, there is that severe emotional distress about attending school. Parents are aware that their child is going to be absent. They know that their child is at home during these school hours, and the child may have a desire to complete their schoolwork. They want to do well in school. However, again, because of this distress that they're experiencing, they aren't able to. And then we see this absence of significant antisocial behavior like lying or stealing. Whereas in truancy, we have a lack of that excessive fear. The kids who are truant, they're enjoying their time out of school. They usually hide the fact that they're missing school from their parents, so they're sneaking away. Again, they're not typically home, they're with their friends or doing other activities that are more exciting. There is this lack of interest in schoolwork. They don't care that they're slipping behind. They're not really too concerned about the material that they're missing. And then here we do see that frequent antisocial behavior, like juvenile delinquency. Next, please. So children refuse to go to school for a variety of reasons. There may be social factors in play, such as bullying or the impact of social media. So needless to say, if a child is being bullied, it may be hard for them to want to return to school and face that bully again. And especially for our middle and high school students, the impact of social media, social media can expose these students at any time to peer pressure, to unrealistic expectations. So if a child is constantly being exposed to posts online that are making them uncomfortable or feel a sense of inadequacy, they may not have that confidence to go back to school. We also have educational factors, such as a learning disability. If a student is already struggling with attending school and school is something that is already a challenge, or they may see that their peers are learning at a faster rate than them, this may discourage them from attending school. We have students who are diagnosed with autism, who are already, again, having that challenge with socializing. So they may easily become overwhelmed by the idea of attending school, being in a classroom or in the lunchroom full of other kids. And lastly, it's very important that we take into consideration the mental health factors. Definitely those diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, they may constantly worry about their schoolwork, how they're doing in school, how to interact with peers. And those may be struggling with depression. We're seeing challenges with feelings of motivation to attend school, feelings of worthlessness, poor concentration, poor sleeping habits. All of these factors may aid a child in not wanting to go to school, and again, pushing that school refusal behavior. Next slide, please. Children are encouraged to avoid school by positive or negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement occurs when a behavior is encouraged by rewards. So now if we have a child who is staying home due to school refusal, but now they're seeing that they have extra opportunities to nap, extra opportunities to stay with mom or dad, watching TV, they are more likely to want to stay home again because these are all favorable conditions. Now in negative reinforcement, we're seeing the behavior be encouraged by the removal of a negative event, of a negative stimulus. So let's say a child does not go to school to avoid that forced socialization, to avoid the bullies, avoid possibly being called on in class. This is a motivating factor in not wanting to go to school because we're taking away these undesirable conditions. Next, please. So here I have a brief video just about the challenges with school refusal. You can play it.
So the first thing you've got to figure out is, why is this kid not going? Is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it they've got something else going on, or there's something going on at school that is dangerous and they wish to avoid? So I need to figure that piece out. And if I find out indeed that it's from this quadrant of anxiety, I'm anxious about something at school. What are you anxious about? Is it a realistic thing to be anxious about, or is it not? So if I'm being threatened at school, I'm going to be anxious, but the solution is not to confront the fear. The solution is to fix the problem. But a lot of kids are fearful of things that are not realistic. So I'm afraid that people are going to call on me in class and I'm going to be uncomfortable. I'm afraid of bad things happening to my family while I'm at school. So things like that start to come in. And social anxiety certainly is a common predictor of school refusal. I'm so scared being with these 30 other kids. I stop going. And you can well imagine that is disruptive in a house. Even being late for school, because parents are often dropping kids at school on the way to their jobs. And if the kid won't get out of the car, I've got a conflict, I've got a lot of tension, I've got a lot of sometimes escalating behavior on both the kid's part and the parent's part. And sometimes parents just say, well, fine, you don't have to go, and they let the kid stay home. And the problem is that provides what we call negative reinforcement. So now the relief comes from not going. So now tomorrow morning, when I have the same thought, I'm going to want to do the same thing. So it starts to perpetuate itself. And a lot of the folks at Rogers, parents come to us because the kid has been functioning okay, but finally they started skipping school and now their functioning is really compromised. We have a very high rate of school refusal in all of our anxiety programs and OCD programs. And a lot of times what's going on is parents are trying their best to make the kid feel good, and then they won't leave the kid until they're quote unquote ready to go. And you've got a parent now for 45 minutes on the blacktop trying to get a kid into school. The kid doesn't want to leave. So we need to teach parents how to do that efficiently. I'm going to make more difficulty if I wait until they're ready. I'm not saying you just throw them on in, but I am saying you got to have a model for how to do this, and you've got to practice with parents so they feel comfortable. And most parents do not like when their kids are upset. Makes them upset. And sometimes the parents themselves have fears, and those fears can be transmitted pretty quickly to the kid. And so we want to make sure I'm working on both sides of this. What are you afraid is going to happen? And do you have people in the school that you trust, that you can turn to and say, would you mind walking her in? And if the parents don't have that, they're going to be sitting there clinging to the kid, and it's going to make the kids reading this like that you don't trust this. And if you don't trust this, why should they? Like that's the point where a parent now says, I don't know what to do. That's where we come in.
Thank you. And we can head over to the next slide. Okay, so a short-term consequence of school refusal is academic difficulties. The longer you are out of school, the more content you miss, the harder it is to catch up. We also typically see family conflict around getting the child to school. I highlighted this before. There's that struggle in the morning on getting the child to school. There's a struggle in understanding why the student is staying home. And there's overall this family conflict on how will we as a family unit overcome the student's school refusal. And when a student is not attending school, they're missing social experiences in class. They're missing that social component of extracurricular activities, speaking to their peers during lunch. And we can definitely see a rise in those peer difficulties if a student is isolating himself or herself or theirself at home and not attending school. And now the long-term consequences of school refusal, we can definitely see that there will be a risk of retention. School refusal, I would consider a very slippery slope. Again, the longer a child is out of school, the harder it is to get them back because they're becoming comfortable in staying home. They're enjoying staying home at some point because they're having that relief of not being in an undesirable situation being taken away. So we have risk of retention, the possibility of repeating the grade or even school dropout. We have underemployment as a long-term risk. Students may not be able to access higher paying jobs or higher skill jobs. And consequently, due to that, we may also see a rise in alcohol abuse or criminal behavior. Next slide, please. Now, in tackling school refusal, I believe it's really important that we not only work with the student, but also the parents and the school. We may want to work with helping students improve their communication skills. We can role play with students to help them navigate some of those scary conversations that they may be afraid of having with peers, with their teachers, how to make new friends, etc. And in an effort to manage anxious arousal, it is really important that we try to teach kids ways that they can relax, ways that they can become comfortable with their distress, comfortable with their anxiety. So helping them understand techniques of self-soothing, or again, doing that psychoeducation on what is relaxation, when is it the best time to implement those strategies, and do some more explaining of how having those bad feelings can transmit into having a stomach ache, having a headache. So how can we counteract those negative feelings of stress and anxiety so we're not at school with a stomach ache, or at least we have a better understanding of what's happening to our body. And maybe in this understanding, we are much more better equipped to cope with it. And now when we work with parents, it's very important, again, that they just have the basic understanding of what school refusal is. Personally, in my work in tackling school refusal, some parents did not have a great understanding on why it was such a big deal that their child did not want to go to school. So having those conversations about what anxiety is, what school refusal is, and what the signs and symptoms are, better helps the parent understand that it is a much more serious problem that we are trying to address, that this is, again, that severe emotional distress and not my kid just wants to stay home and play video games. Also in working with parents, identifying those patterns of reinforcement. It is in their nature for most parents to want to take away any discomfort that their child may be feeling. So again, if a child says, "Mom, I have a stomach ache and my head is hurting really bad, can I stay home?" A mom or a parent or caretaker may feel likely to give them a pass and say, "Sure, you can stay home for today." But again, when it becomes chronic, that's when we need to start addressing and implementing certain interventions to help the family and the child realize that there's possibly an underlying problem at hand. And working with the school, I will say every school is different. Some schools are more flexible than others when addressing school refusal. An option could be working with the school to implement a partial day schedule. Maybe a student who's having a hard time coming back into the classroom, maybe they can only do half days on certain days, or maybe we can allow them to leave school early. Identifying what specific rewards exist within the school to motivate the student. A very, very big motivating factor in the high school, when I was working with the kids, it was sports. So we have a child who's maybe at home refusing to go to school, but a factor that is adding to their anxiety is that they can't play basketball this season. And we say, okay, let's create a schedule, and where if you attend this number of full days of school, you may be allowed to try out for the team. So finding ways that motivate the students to at least get them back in the building is a starting point. I will share that at Dover, we did see that there was a very, very significant decline in academic grades and in attendance. And we understand that there is a whole pandemic happening, that there are a lot of mental health factors in play. Students do not have the motivation or empowerment to step back into the building and address X, Y, and Z, the anxiety of being in the classroom, seeing their friends again, meeting new teachers. How can we accommodate? And what we did was a credit recovery program where we had academic advisors assigned to each student that was at risk of possibly failing a course, explaining the content to them virtually, in person, or at home, and then letting them know that we are here to support them through this process. And if we did a set of assignments, is how I will describe it. If we can work through these assignments together, we can submit them to your teacher for full credit. And it was not the workload of an entire quarter or the entire year, but it was introducing some amount of schoolwork to the child, to the student, and helping them recognize and understand that as a school, we are there to support them, and that their effort in working with us translates into their effort for the entire semester, because we understand that even doing the bare minimum was very, very hard. And next slide. And I believe that is all I have for you all today. Thank you for having me. And if there are any questions or comments, or if anybody has any similar experiences in working with their students, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Alanna. I don't see any questions in the chat box. I had a couple of my own. So actually maybe we'll go backwards a little bit. So the most recent thing you talked about that I wanted to ask about was the credit recovery program that you mentioned. I mean, it might be a little early to tell. It's like October, and I know most schools either just went back in September, or maybe some schools were open at the end of the spring. semester, too. So it might be too early to actually tell this, but if you have any data, what kind of success have you seen from that credit recovery program? Have you seen students becoming more motivated? Have you seen the grades improving, things like that?
I will say from my my personal relationships with the students and helping them as their academic advisor, I did see for a number of students, I would say about half, through my constant efforts to communicate with them, engage with them, and come from a place that wasn't so academic, that was more so, hi, I'm here to assist you with the credit recovery program. I understand this year has been hard, it's been difficult. So if there are any other circumstances or issues that you would like to talk about first, we can definitely do that. So letting them know that, yes, I am a individual who works in a school, but I understand that there are other things going on right now, and we can have those type of discussions. So in having those discussions, I did have a lot of high schoolers tell me that they were dealing with issues of anxiety, they were dealing with depression. So I think, as a social worker speaking, those are the successes and those are the wins that I get. Not necessarily that they submitted the packet for credit. Of course, I wanted them to do that, but I wanted them to understand that even though this is school and we want you to pass, we want you to get good grades, we also want you to be healthy. We want you to be safe, and we want you to be able to speak to us about some concerns that you are facing in your personal life. So I definitely would say that from the credit recovery program, we did see a lot of the students boost their grades, be able to pass the year, again, by doing that bare minimum. But the true success for me is seeing the amount of students that were able to have the courage to say, this is what I'm struggling with. And if you can be patient with me and work with me through this, we would love that. And I do want to share that a challenge of the credit recovery program that I saw a lot of was, possibly educators and teachers not being open to the credit recovery program. They thought, well, we have students that have worked all semester, have worked all quarter to submit all of those assignments, to submit quality work. And now we're allowing some students to submit maybe 5 assignments and then they'll get a grade just as great as the other kids. But this is why I highlighted it in my presentation. We can't group kids who are school refusing with kids who are truant. We can't look at them as kids who are just at home, blowing off school, having the time of their lives, because we are working with kids who are at home, concerned about their grades, can't communicate that they're concerned about them, and need that additional support.
Thank you. And actually that kind of piggybacks on a question that I had. So I was just thinking about when you were talking, Tracy and Annette's presentation, when they were talking about one of the things that's causing anxiety is, as kids go back to school, is teacher expectations, that the teachers are expecting kids to be, at the place they would normally be, entering the grade that they're entering, and that's just not happening. I mean, these kids lost, a good year minimum of traditional schooling, so I was wondering, I was wondering about that, if what kind of training, and you can speak to Dover, and you can also speak if anything else that I know that I'm sure you've researched this beyond what just Dover is doing. Is there education happening with the teachers themselves, and specific interventions that teachers can be doing in the classroom to help with these behaviors?
So definitely, it's been, I would consider, one of the main themes of this school year, during our faculty meetings, during our faculty trainings, that we need to have this understanding that, like Annette said, children have not been in the school for a very long time following an in-person full day schedule. So we have, like Annette said, some high schoolers who are talking about going to college and taking the SATs, but the last time they were in school, they were freshmen. Right now, we have third graders who haven't been in school since they were in first grade. We have our sixth graders in the elementary school I work in, who are supposed to be the leaders of the school and role models, behaving at times like fourth graders. So it definitely was something that we had to train and drill into our teachers that these are the circumstances we're working with. We have to remember that not only did we go through a lot during the pandemic and trying to navigate the school system, but the students struggled very hard with adjusting to remote learning, not having that socialization. So I think as long as a school has that understanding that we need to be patient, we need to be more empathetic with our kids. That's a great starting point. We do have trainings scheduled in the upcoming weeks just to highlight the effects of COVID, how they have had great impacts on anxiety, self-presentation, school refusal. So definitely, I think schools, not just over, are having those talks around the anxiety piece of returning to school now.
So I'm only vaguely familiar with IEPs. I have small children. I actually haven't had my kids don't have an IEP, but I'm just vaguely familiar with them from just being a parent and being kind of exposed to that. What parents are going through and being on, Facebook mom groups and stuff like that. Is it possible for a child who's experiencing school refusal for them to have an IEP that better identifies like specific strategies and possibly also special circumstances when they're doing their learning to help them and to motivate them, and for the benefit of the room, including myself, if you could just help us understand exactly a little bit more about what an IEP is, that would be helpful too, just as a starting point.
Sure. So an IEP is an individual educational plan that lists accommodations or certain strategies or additional services that a child may be eligible for or may benefit from if placed in the classroom. So at least in Dover, and if anybody else has a different experience in the school that they're working in, please feel free to jump in. But in Dover, IEPs are only for students who are classified. So students who have a diagnosis, students who are in special education classes. However, we do have an intervention team, meaning that when teachers have concerns about student behavior, student attendance, they make a referral to our intervention teams, who then meet to observe the child in the class or to speak to the child, speak to the teacher about what concerns they do have, and then create a list of strategies to support not only the student in the classroom, but also the teacher in how to better manage the classroom, how to address the needs of that student. So we definitely do have, like I said, intervention teams that create those strategies and those interventions to target students who are having a little more difficulty transitioning back into the classroom.
And there are a couple of things coming in on the chat, just talking about a 504 plan that can be helpful when an IEP is not needed. I don't know what a 504 plan is.
I am not too familiar with the 504 plans. Annette, are you able to speak on that?
So my daughter actually just recently was approved for a 504 plan because she fit perfectly into exactly what Alanna was mentioning with school refusal. Like, she was coming home saying that she wasn't very bright, that she was stupid. And we were having the same issue with the teacher wanting her to pick up right where, she left off. And she has not had not one normal school year because she's in second grade, and kindergarten in the district that I am in was part-time at that time. So she was only going in the afternoons. So here she is in second grade with this very intense teacher, like, don't count on your fingers, and, don't try to remember your spelling. And, she had no idea what she was talking about, and she was falling apart. So when I met with the school counselor and their intervention team, they said very plainly that she was not going to get an IEP because she did not need any accommodations. And she didn't have any sensory issues or speech, but she clearly, her mental health was suffering. So we all got together and figured out what, like, little interventions for her to help her, like allowing her to use a very simple number line that's on her desk and not blocking it when she's, trying to count. And, giving her those accolades. Like, the teacher wanted it to be intrinsic, but she's not mature for that yet. She has no idea what you're talking about, so it was surprisingly a bit of a struggle. I thought it was going to be a quick, hey, I'm a mom, I work in this community, I understand. And it wasn't. I got a lot of pushback. So I had to go through the motions of what a parent would go through to get an IEP, just to get a 504. And personally, I think all kids should have a 504. We all have, little things that would help us, a smile, a sticker, a star, something along those lines. But now, that's in place, and we see a huge improvement in her wanting to go to school, in her the way she talks about herself, her resiliency. Like, now she says, I don't know that yet, when before it was like, I'm never going to get it. Now it's, I don't know it yet, but I'm getting there. So that's just my 12 cents with 504.
Thank you. That was extremely helpful to our conversation, and I thank you for sharing. I do want to highlight that pushback. That's something that gets me right here.
Yes, and as a mom too, I was caught between professionalism, anger, heartbreak. It was I was very surprised at the pushback. I really was. I was like, what?
And again, we need to use that advocacy for our kids, for our students, to explain again what anxiety is, how school refusal is different from truancy, how our kids are delayed because of the pandemic, and this is not their fault. So I feel like this is a conversation that sometimes is beat into the public, but again, there's always that pushback, and we need to be there to continue enforcing that message that we won't back down. I think I saw somebody had their, oh yes, Christine.
It's more of a comment. So I work for Child Protection, and last year I was noticed, so we obviously get the truancy phone calls. So, and one of my roles in the agency is as the educational stability liaison. So workers were coming to me, letting me know we were getting phone calls about schools filing for truancy last year, a lot. And I noticed it way more often than I had ever noticed it in like pre-pandemic. And what I was finding was like, it was on families that had been truant the year before. But I just found it interesting that the schools didn't make any moves before the pandemic. And then in the middle of the pandemic, they thought it was a great idea to like now file for truancy on these families, when, obviously there's more a reason for kids to, because obviously they had issues the year before with mental health, assuming, right, with anxiety and things like that. And now it's just heightened during the pandemic. And then in addition to that, there were no services being offered to help these kids. Like pre-pandemic, we could have sent somebody to the house, right, to like get the kid out of bed, or like help the family come up with a schedule to like, and a behavior chart to like motivate them to get out of bed. People weren't going to the houses then. So like, I just thought I was really frustrating on my end to see that coming from schools. Like I really did feel like it was the most insensitive thing that they could have been doing. So again, that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you for sharing. No, for sure. When you come from more of a social work or counseling based perspective, being in an educational setting or just a different setting, we have a different way of viewing things and understanding things. So like I said, that pushback, that's common, I feel, for those of us who are in those situations. And just continuing to do that psychoeducation, continuing to do that advocacy for our students, because the last thing we want is to group them into the stigmas that they're afraid of falling under, because they're at home thinking about, how am I going to pass the year? I'm never going to go back to school. I care so much about my grades, but my teachers probably think that I'm blowing them off. They think that I don't care about my grades and X, Y, and Z. So thank you so much, Christine, for sharing.
Yes, thank you, to Christine and to Annette, I think it was, who was sharing earlier. So such great feedback. So it's a good thing that we started this part of the presentation 15 minutes early, because we obviously have a lot to think and feel and say about it. There was one more question in the chat box from earlier, and so I'm going to ask you so this is about the slides. I'm just gonna double check with Tracy and Annette and Alanna. Is it okay to share the slides with the registrants today? So we can go ahead and we can email those out to everybody who registered for the webinar today. And I'm gonna ask you the same question, Alanna. Are you available to do additional training on this topic or anything like that?
As of right now, the training that I do is only available to the parents in the district. Hopefully that will change over the next couple of months. We're still hashing out some of the responsibilities in my role, but eventually I hope that more trainings to the public will become more available from my end.
Well, I appreciate you being here today. We appreciate you being here today so much. Now, one other thing is, I did mention before that this workshop was organized by the Youth Advocate Committee, and that their goals, actually starting right after this conference, are going to be focused on engaging the schools more. So if this is a topic that you're really passionate about, and that you want to be more involved in collaborating with the schools more, having the community providers in the schools just be in better conversation, then this is definitely a good thing to do, to reach out to Jennifer. And I think I put her information in the chat box earlier, but if you could do that again, Jen. So Jen is the chair of our Youth Advocate Committee. So the other thing that she just put in the chat box is the survey. We are going to end about 2 minutes early, and that will hopefully give you the opportunity to click on that link before you even exit out of the presentation today to just fill out that quick survey. It's just a few questions on the success of the presentation. I again want to thank Jennifer, and actually somebody who's not here today, Rebecca Butts from Family Promise, who actually did a lot of the behind the scenes work preparing for today's workshop. And unfortunately, she was unable to be with us this morning. And so I want to thank both of them for all the work that they did, Jennifer and Rebecca. And I want to thank our presenters again, Tracy, Annette, and Alanna. This was fantastic. I mean, really, I feel like all of my expectations were exceeded. So I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you stay CAS friends, friends with CAS, for as long as you possibly can. So again, if you could just go ahead and fill out that survey. If you are interested in reaching out to any of the presenters today, all of their information was in the chat box, but we will also send out their contact information along with the slides from today's presentation at the end. Ryan, hang on one second.
The joys
Working
of being
from
home.
It's my turn. I take over the kid, the daycare next. Thank you again. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And like I said, fill out that survey and join us in future CAS workshops. Take care.
Thank you.